You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, I ask you all the time about consequences for these U.S. attorneys. There's these lawyers, prosecutors who defy the law in deference to Trump, especially when it comes to their law licenses. We finally have some news on that front. Can you explain what just happened? Brian, we talk about this all the time. Well, I'm happy to report that the state of Florida, the state bar, is investigating Lindsay Halligan for alleged misconduct. We do talk all the time about how these DOJ lawyers, these Donald Trump flunkies, are evading any kind of accountability, even when they get caught doing things wrong, red-handed by federal judges who put on the record that they are misrepresenting, that they're not being candid with the court, that they're violating the rules. Brian, we talk all the time about how, in theory, State Bar Council can open ethics investigations and can end up sanctioning lawyers who engage in misconduct up to and including disbarring them from ever practicing law again. And, that kind of accountability seems to move forward in fits and starts. It took a couple of years for both New York and D.C. to disbar Rudy Giuliani, but today we got a report, I think first in the New York Times, that the Florida State Bar has opened an investigation into Lindsay Halligan. Our viewers will no doubt remember Lindsay Halligan was basically the fake U.S. attorney who had no lawful authority to set foot in a grand jury. Yet she walked into 2 grand juries in Virginia and walked out of one with a criminal indictment of former FBI Director James Comey, and walked out of the other with an indictment of New York State Attorney General Letitia James. Now, mind you, both of them have been thrown out by federal judges because she didn't have the lawful authority to do it. But importantly, in the James Comey case, there was some litigation that resulted in the grand jury minutes. That is, the audio recordings of everything Lindsay Halligan did inside that secret proceeding, that grand jury room. Those grand jury minutes were turned over to James Comey's defense attorney, and lo and behold, there was misconduct by Lindsay Halligan. That's the allegation. In fact, I would suggest, Brian, that this ethics investigation should be fairly easy for the Florida State Bar because a judge, among other things, said Lindsay Halligan made fundamental mistakes of law in the grand jury that could compromise the integrity of the grand jury proceedings against James Comey. Mind you, that is just one thing that one federal judge has said about Lindsay Halligan's conduct. So, I'm happy to report that as of right now, there is an ethics investigation being conducted by the Florida State Bar into Lindsay Halligan. Glenn, would you think it's fair to say that the bigger hurdle to overcome here was actually getting this ethics investigation by the Bar Council started, as opposed to once it started, them finding that she did indeed abuse her law license, or that she should be disbarred? Because like you said, the facts, the evidence surrounding this thing is pretty clear, but the likelihood of them actually starting it, that was, that nobody really has control over. That's up to them to decide whether or not they want to engage in this. I think that's a fair observation and even a fair inference, given that these things seem to take so long to get going. But the way this one played out, there was a nonprofit organization called the Campaign for Accountability, and they filed a complaint against Lindsay Halligan. They got a reply back from the Florida State Bar that said, "We already have an ethics investigation open into Lindsay Halligan." So that kind of begs the question, when did it start? How long has it been going on? Who filed it? But, so these things are not at all transparent. These things are always kept under wraps. Why? Well, because sometimes there are allegations made against attorneys that are not sort of based in any fact. We often have people who are aggrieved at attorneys for any number of reasons, and they just go ahead and file all sorts of baseless complaints. So it's not a surprise that these things are kept under wraps. But it does often seem to take too long when attorneys like Lindsay Halligan can hop from one grand jury to another, engaging in misconduct. It seems like that's the kind of thing that a state bar in Lindsay Halligan holds her license to practice law in the state of Florida. A state bar would want to attack pretty aggressively. So, Glenn, I want to ask you about the Florida of it all. But before I do that, just a note for everybody who's watching right now. If you'd like to stay on top of legal news, Glenn and I do these videos every single day. Okay, so the best way to stay on top of this stuff and support our work is to subscribe to both of our channels. I'm going to put those links in the post description of this video. If you're not yet subscribed, please head into the post description, click on the links to our channels, and hit the subscribe button. 100% free to do so, but again, a great way to support our work. So, Glenn, as I was mentioning before, it's difficult not to look at Florida and have a lot of thoughts about that state. There's a lot of baggage that comes with that state. This is the state of Ron DeSantis. We've seen a lot of kind of abusive behavior, even by the institutional elements in that state. Do you think that the bar is kind of above the fray when it comes to politics? And even if it's, the bar in Florida versus the bar, in California or New York or wherever it may be, that when they're looking for abuses, the political affiliation of the person who they're investigating doesn't matter. So my answer is, I would like to think that the Bar Council in the 50 states and in the District of Columbia are largely above the political fray. I even happen to believe that that is likely true. The people who gravitate toward wanting to conduct oversight of attorney conduct and attorney ethics and be part of the investigation into allegations of attorney misconduct are typically not political people. They're people who really care deeply about the honest practice of law, and that's probably why they gravitate toward those kind of jobs. But of course, Florida is Florida. It is a deeply red state. And when we have problematic people who govern there, like Ron DeSantis, and let's remember Pam Bondi was the Attorney General, I believe, for 2 terms in Florida. That can lead you to wonder aloud, well, just how saturated is the apparatus in Florida with people who are driven by politics and less concerned about the rule of law, our Constitution, the ethics of the attorneys who are licensed to practice there. But I'm going to stick with my best guess, which is that the kind of people who gravitate toward these positions, whether in red states or blue states, are generally just concerned with closely guarding the ethics of the legal profession. So looking at somebody like Lindsay Hall, and I'm focused on her because, well, that's what we're talking about right now. But I also think that what happens here will be instructive to other people who come next, or at least they should be, right? I mean, Lindsay Halligan should have learned from Jenna Ellis and Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman. But of course they never do because they just get drunk on proximity to power. But let's say that because Lindsay Halligan is the most recent example of a U.S. attorney who is perfectly content to abuse her position in blind deference to Trump. What are her prospects if she's disbarred? What kind of, how does that limit her ability to work in this profession that she's dedicated her life to? Because I think, that will serve as a kind of a blinking red light, a warning to any other U.S. attorneys who Donald Trump inevitably asks to do his bidding. But then they're watching what happens to this U.S. attorney who did. Brian, usually it would be sort of a professional disqualifier first and foremost and most directly. You can't practice law anymore if you've been disbarred. But also, people used to have some shame. There used to be consequences for being caught engaging in this kind of misconduct that results in disbarment. A quaint world where shame was enough of a driver to get people to not do something. Yeah. I long for the day when an attorney who was disbarred, basically would be a professional pariah. They wouldn't be able to get a job in any, respectable administration. But, maybe being disbarred is kind of a perk on one's resume when you're applying for some political position in the Trump administration. So listen, that's kind of making light of it. But if you are a disbarred lawyer, that is going to haunt you for the rest of your days. Even if you can plug into some, Trump administration position or agency, it's a real stain on one's career. Can you speak a little bit about these past lawyers, attorneys, prosecutors who have, basically sacrificed their livelihoods in deference to Trump and where they are now? It's incredible because Rudy Giuliani, of course, mayor of New York. Talk about an enormous fall from grace when he ends up doing Donald Trump's dirty bidding, trying to, help him steal an election he lost. He gets disbarred in New York. He gets disbarred in the District of Columbia. He gets successfully sued for defamation for the two Georgia state election workers, Shay Moss and Ruby Freeman. And he, basically has to give over in furtherance of a money judgment that was entered against him, tons and tons and tons of his assets. I can't imagine he has much left. But then you look at the Kenneth Chesbrough of the Sad affair, another lawyer who seemed to be well regarded before he decided to plug in to Donald Trump's corrupt scheme to try to win an election. He's not only been disbarred, he is now a convicted criminal because he pleaded guilty to being part of the corrupt scheme down in Georgia. You've got John Eastman, who was a law professor, for gosh sakes, also kind of the architect of the fake elector scheme. Disbarred. I don't know if he's found gainful employment anywhere. And of course, you've got Jeffrey Clark, that was the dirty DOJ official who wanted to take over the Department of Justice and help from the inside, undermine the results of the 2020 election. Even, trying to use DOJ's letterhead to send a letter down to Georgia and to other battleground states saying, wait a minute. We think there's all kinds of fraud undermining the election's results, even though there was no evidence supporting that. Both, DOJ leadership and also the agencies and organizations that were directly involved in protecting and promoting election integrity said this is the safest, most secure American election in history. But all of these attorneys, one after another, end up being disbarred, and goodness knows what kind of employment they can secure for themselves. So the question becomes, don't today's lawyers who are plugging in to Donald Trump's dirty deeds see this as a cautionary tale? I know power must be a wonderful and intoxicating thing for some, but do you really want to sacrifice your entire professional career? Because, you may be flying high with your proximity to power right now, but you will fall. Not to mention, Donald Trump will ultimately introduce all of these people to the undercarriage of a bus, as he just did today with Christine Nome, right? And to answer that question, no, these people won't recognize it because the reality is the fact that they're working for him right now after he's already thrown so many people under the bus, after he's already abandoned Michael Cohen and George Papadopoulos and Gordon Sland and Mike Pence and Marjorie Taylor Greene. His whole administration, his whole orbit is a graveyard of former allies. And so if those people didn't recognize it at the point that they came close to him, they're never going to recognize it, or it's not going to matter because, like you said, they're just drunk on proximity to power, and that's enough for them. But I guess the one thing that they should recognize is they shouldn't be surprised if and when it happens to them, because if we've learned anything, especially with the Christine situation, it comes for everybody at some point. With that said, again, for those who are watching right now, if you'd like to stay on top of all legal news, we're going to continue doing these videos. So the best way to follow our work is to subscribe to both of our channels. I'm going to put those links right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Taylor Cohen, and I'm Glenn Kersner. You're watching The Legal Breakdown.